was supposed to be a calm morning. The city was slowly waking up, with traffic lights blinking in rhythm and people rushing to grab their first coffee of the day. The streets were still quiet enough that you could hear birds and the occasional distant siren. Inside the small electronics store near the edge of downtown, a few early customers browsed through phones, headphones, and accessories. Nothing about the day hinted at the chaos that was about to unfold. A store employee stood behind the counter, tapping nervously on the register as a man walked in. He looked like any regular customer, casual clothes, a baseball cap, and a calm expression. He moved slowly, scanning the rows of gadgets with quiet interest. To anyone watching, he didn't seem suspicious. He wasn't glancing around or acting nervous. Still, the young clerk at the counter couldn't help but keep an eye on him. After a few minutes, the man picked up a small wireless speaker and headed toward the counter. The clerk rang it up, handed him the receipt, and watched him leave. Everything seemed fine, but only a few minutes later, another employee came running from the back saying they were missing one of the display tablets. Confusion filled the air. The manager, who had just arrived, checked the security feed and saw the same man near the display table earlier. The footage wasn't clear, only a figure in a cap reaching for something before walking toward the front. The manager froze, thinking the worst. Without waiting to double-check, he grabbed the phone and called the police. A patrol car arrived within 10 minutes. 2 officers stepped out, calm but alert, and entered the store. The manager rushed over to them, pointing to the blurry footage and explaining what happened. "That's the guy," he said firmly. "He just walked out. I think he took it." The officers nodded and started searching the nearby area. It didn't take long. They found the man only a few blocks away, walking along the sidewalk with a small shopping bag in his hand. When the officers approached, he turned to them with a polite but puzzled look. "Sir, we need to speak with you for a moment," one officer said. "Of course," the man replied quietly. They asked to see what was in his bag. Inside was the wireless speaker he had just bought, with a receipt neatly folded on top. Everything looked legitimate. Still, one of the officers explained that there had been a report of a missing item, and that he matched the description. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or get defensive. He just said, "I understand," and stood still while they continued asking questions. "Do you have any identification on you?" He patted his pockets, then gave a faint smile. "Not with me, no. I left my wallet at home." The officers looked at each other. One of them radioed back to the station for guidance. Protocol required them to bring the person in if he couldn't verify his identity and was involved in a theft report. The man didn't resist when they told him he'd need to come with them. He simply nodded, calm as ever, as they gently placed handcuffs on him and led him toward the patrol car. People passing by slowed down to watch. Some whispered, some pulled out their phones. The man kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, moving quietly as if he didn't want to draw any more attention. The officers weren't harsh, they followed the rules. To them, he was just another case to be processed and sorted out later at the station. The drive back was silent. One officer focused on the road while the other glanced occasionally at their passenger through the mirror. There was something different about him, his posture, his tone. Most people in this situation would be anxious, defensive, or pleading. But this man looked patient, almost as if he was studying them instead of fearing what might happen next. At the precinct, they brought him inside for booking. The officer at the front desk filled out the intake form and asked for a name. "I'd rather not say just yet," the man replied gently. "You can do your checks." "I'm not going anywhere." The officer frowned but didn't argue. Rules were rules. If someone refused to identify themselves, they could hold them until their identity was confirmed. They took his fingerprints, logged his belongings, and placed him in a small holding room. Through the narrow window, other officers passed by, glancing curiously at the quiet man sitting alone. Word started to spread that morning. An unknown suspect had been brought in for shoplifting. Nothing unusual, but something about the man's calm attitude caught people's attention. One officer mentioned how polite he was during the arrest. Another said he seemed too composed, like someone who knew more than he was saying. The talk spread quickly, as gossip tends to do in a police building. Meanwhile, in the evidence room, the missing tablet from the store was still being searched for. One of the younger officers checked the call log again, wondering if maybe the store had made a mistake. The clerk sounded unsure on the phone replay, like he wasn't completely certain the man had stolen anything. Still, procedures had to be followed. A few hours passed. The man remained quiet in the holding room. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't demand anything, just sat with his hands resting on his knees, waiting. Officers came and went, giving short glances through the window. Some felt awkward. There was something about his steady calm that made them uneasy. Finally, the rookie officer assigned to process fingerprints sat down at her desk to check the database results. She typed in the case number, expecting another routine entry. But within seconds, the screen flashed a result that made her eyes widen. She blinked and checked again, thinking she might have made a typo. But no, the system confirmed it. The man sitting in the holding room wasn't an ordinary citizen. Her heart started to race. She looked around, unsure if she should say it out loud. Then she quietly called her supervisor over. When he saw the name on the screen, he froze. The color drained from his face. "That can't be right," he whispered. But it was. The fingerprint record matched exactly, with a senior officer in their own department. The room fell into a heavy silence. No one could believe it. The man they had handcuffed on the street was not a random suspect. He was one of their highest-ranking officers, someone who had been in charge of several major operations, respected by everyone, and known for his calm and disciplined nature. He had been on personal leave, out of uniform, and no one recognized him in casual clothes. The supervisor quickly left his desk and rushed toward the holding area. Other officers followed, whispering in disbelief. When they reached the small room, the man looked up at them with the same quiet expression he had since the beginning. No anger, no panic, just quiet observation. "Sir," the supervisor said carefully, his voice uneasy. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" The man smiled faintly. "You didn't ask. You followed procedure." "That's good." The air in the hallway was thick with shock. Some of the younger officers didn't know what to say. They had just handcuffed and processed their own deputy chief, completely unaware of who he was. The realization made their stomachs twist. Some felt embarrassed. Others impressed that he hadn't tried to use his position to stop the process. Meanwhile, back at the store, the manager finally discovered the truth about the missing tablet. It hadn't been stolen at all. It had been misplaced during a stock transfer earlier that morning. When the police called back to confirm, the manager's voice trembled with guilt. "Please tell that man we're so sorry," he said. But it was too late. The story had already taken a life of its own inside the department. At the station, the deputy chief, still calm, still polite, simply nodded when the cuffs were removed. "You did your jobs," he said softly. "That's what matters." No one knew exactly how to respond. It was one of those rare moments where everyone in the room realized how fragile perception could be. The same man who led them with authority was treated like any other citizen, simply because he wasn't recognized. No one had treated him unfairly, but no one had truly looked beyond the surface either. That night, the precinct was quieter than usual. Conversations were shorter, tones were gentler. The officers who had been involved in the arrest replayed the event in their minds, wondering what they could have done differently. But deep down they knew he wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed proud. They had no idea yet that the next day this quiet incident would ripple through the department, sparking meetings, discussions, and new rules. But for now it was just a strange, unforgettable day. A day when the officers learned that anyone, no matter their title, could find themselves on the other side of the badge. The next morning the station felt strangely quiet. People walked through the halls like they were carrying invisible weight. Conversations that usually filled the building were replaced by awkward silences and whispers. Everyone knew what had happened the day before, but no one wanted to be the first to bring it up. The arrest of their own deputy chief had shaken the entire department to its core. In one corner of the office, the two officers who had handled the arrest sat at their desks, staring at the same reports they had read 5 times already. Neither of them could focus. Every few minutes one would glance toward the hallway, half expecting someone to call them into the captain's office. The waiting was the worst part. "Do you think he's angry?" one of them asked quietly. The other shook his head. "He didn't seem angry, just calm. Too calm, maybe." They both fell silent again. In another room, the rookie officer who had discovered the deputy chief's identity still felt her heart skip every time she replayed the moment she saw his name appear on the computer screen. She had double-checked the record 3 times before calling her supervisor, terrified she might have made a mistake. She still couldn't believe it. How could someone so respected just sit quietly while everyone processed him like an ordinary suspect? By mid-morning, word had spread beyond the building. Officers from nearby precincts were calling to confirm if the rumor was true. Even though the department tried to keep things internal, stories like this never stayed quiet for long. Some people laughed awkwardly. Others defended him, saying he must have had a reason. But no one knew the full truth yet. At around 10 o'clock, the deputy chief walked into the building. This time, dressed neatly in a collared shirt and jacket, his calm expression was unchanged. The same officers who had processed him the day before were now standing near the entrance, unsure whether to greet him or look away. He gave a small nod to each of them and walked straight toward the captain's office. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The captain, who had been with the department for over 20 years, stood up as soon as the door opened. He had seen a lot of strange things in his career, but nothing like this. "Good morning," the deputy chief said simply, closing the door behind him. "Morning," the captain replied. "I suppose we should talk about what happened." The deputy chief smiled faintly. "I was hoping we would." The conversation lasted almost an hour. No one outside knew what was being said, but a few snippets were overheard when the door opened briefly. A calm voice explaining, another voice full of concern. When the meeting finally ended, the captain came out looking thoughtful, not angry. The deputy chief followed behind him, stopping briefly in the hallway. He looked around the room at the officers pretending to be busy at their desks. His voice was quiet but clear. "No one is in trouble," he said. "You all did your jobs. You followed procedure. That's what I wanted to see." There was a long pause. People exchanged confused glances. "Wanted to see?" one of them whispered after he walked away. That was the beginning of the truth coming out. Later that afternoon, a small meeting was called in the briefing room. Only a handful of people were invited. The officers involved in the arrest, a few supervisors, and the rookie from the fingerprint desk. They sat in uneasy silence until the deputy chief entered, carrying a folder and a calm smile. "I know yesterday was confusing," he began. "Some of you might still be wondering why I didn't identify myself when I was arrested." He paused, looking around the room. "I wasn't testing you as individuals. I was testing the process." Everyone leaned in slightly. The captain stood near the wall, arms crossed, listening closely. "I wanted to know," the deputy chief continued, "how our team handles a situation when the person they're dealing with is uncooperative but calm. When there's no aggression, no clear evidence, just uncertainty. I wanted to see if we still treated that person with fairness and respect." He stopped for a moment, letting his words sink in. No one spoke. The sound of the air conditioner filled the silence. "What I saw," he said finally, "was professionalism. You didn't raise your voices. You didn't assume guilt. You followed every rule step by step, and you did it with restraint. That's exactly how it should be done." Relief washed over the room. The officers exchanged small, uncertain smiles, realizing they weren't in trouble after all. Then his tone shifted slightly. "But there's also something we need to learn from this." He explained how the store manager had jumped to conclusions, how the call was made before the facts were clear, and how quickly assumptions turned into action. "The store made a mistake," he said, "but we all share the responsibility to verify before we act. Sometimes we rush because we don't want to seem slow or careless, but real care is about patience." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blame anyone. He just spoke like a teacher guiding his students through a lesson learned the hard way. Everyone listened in complete silence. After the meeting, as people left the room, a strange feeling lingered. Not guilt, not embarrassment, but something closer to respect. The deputy chief had every reason to be angry, yet he wasn't. Instead, he used the entire experience as a mirror, showing the department who they were when no one was watching. By the next day, the story had reached nearly every corner of the department. Some officers admired him even more. Others said quietly that what he did was risky, that he could have been treated harshly by mistake. But the more people talked, the clearer the message became. It was a reminder of humility, a reminder that authority doesn't put anyone above the law. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the station windows, the rookie officer found herself face to face with the deputy chief in the hallway. She froze, unsure if she should apologize again. He smiled kindly. "You did the right thing," he said. "Always trust the process, even when it surprises you." She nodded, still a little nervous. "I just didn't expect it to be you." Neither did I, he said with a chuckle. Life has a way of humbling all of us. Later that week, the department gathered for their regular briefing. Normally, these meetings were filled with charts, case updates, and a long list of assignments. But that morning, the mood was different. The deputy chief stood at the front, speaking openly about what happened. He didn't name anyone, didn't make it about himself. Instead, he focused on what it revealed. We work in a world of quick judgments, he said. We're trained to read situations fast, to act before things get worse. But that same instinct can blind us if we don't slow down. Yesterday, I was the one in the chair, and I realized how easy it is to feel powerless even when you've done nothing wrong. Remember that feeling when you deal with others? The room was silent. Every officer knew exactly what he meant. Many of them had seen fear or confusion in the eyes of people they'd arrested before, but they had never imagined how it felt to be on the other side. He ended with a quiet reminder. Our power is not in the badge or the uniform. It's in how we treat people. That's what defines us. When the meeting ended, people stayed seated for a moment thinking. No one rushed to the door. Some looked down, others nodded slowly, processing the weight of his words. Outside, life in the city went on. The store that had sparked the incident apologized publicly for the misunderstanding. The manager even called the department personally to express regret. The deputy chief accepted the apology without bitterness. Mistakes happen, he said simply. What matters is what we learn from them. Days turned into weeks, and the story slowly faded from the gossip circuit, but the lesson didn't. Training officers began using the event as a case study in discussions about procedure, communication, and perception. The department quietly updated its policy to require at least 2 layers of verification before detaining someone based on unclear footage. It wasn't a grand reform, but it was a step. A small, meaningful step toward more thoughtful policing. For the officers directly involved, the experience left a permanent mark. They became more careful, more patient, more aware of the weight their actions carried. One of them admitted later that he thought about that day every time he put handcuffs on someone, always remembering that sometimes the person in front of you could be anyone. A teacher, a doctor, a parent, even a leader in your own department. And for the deputy chief, it became something deeper. He had gone into that store that morning just to buy a small speaker. He left with a story that would shape his department for years to come. He never wanted attention or praise for it. In fact, he asked that the story not be shared outside the department, but life has a way of making its lessons travel. That single arrest, born out of misunderstanding and chance, ended up teaching more about justice, humility, and respect than any training manual ever could. And as everyone in the building quietly admitted to themselves, it truly was the arrest that stunned the department, not because of who was arrested, but because of what it revealed about everyone involved. The story of that unusual arrest didn't disappear as quickly as everyone hoped. Even though the department tried to move forward, the incident stayed fresh in people's minds. It wasn't about embarrassment anymore, it was about realization. Every officer had seen how easily misunderstanding could happen, how quickly judgment could form, and how important patience was in their line of work. But for the deputy chief, it went even deeper. In the days after the arrest, he couldn't stop thinking about the small details. The way the young officer spoke to him respectfully, even while handcuffing him. The careful tone of the rookie at the fingerprint desk. The confusion in the manager's voice when he realized the mistake. It all played in his head like small lessons stitched together into something meaningful. He had spent more than 20 years in the force, rising through the ranks, earning medals, attending ceremonies. But what happened that morning had shown him something no award ever could. How the system looked from the outside. For once, he wasn't a badge or a title. He was just a man being processed through the same steps every citizen would face. And that changed something in him. A week later, during a quiet evening at the precinct, he walked through the hallways, stopping at each division. Most officers were finishing reports or preparing to leave. When he passed by, people straightened up automatically. He wasn't intimidating, he never was, but his presence carried a calm authority that made people listen. He stopped by the duty desk, leaned slightly on the counter, and asked how things were going. "Busy day," the officer said, forcing a small smile. "Busy is good," he replied with a nod. "It means we're useful." Then he looked around the room for a moment before saying, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last week. I don't want it to fade away like another strange story we laugh about later. I want us to learn from it, all of us, including me." The officer listened quietly. The deputy chief's tone was calm, but his words carried weight. He continued, "Sometimes we forget that people see the badge before they see the person. That morning reminded me that behind every report, every call, there's someone scared or confused. We deal with people on their worst days. That's not easy, but it's what makes this job matter." After that night, he began organizing small, informal sessions. Not official meetings, just honest talks. He'd invite a few officers at a time to sit in the break room, grab some coffee, and talk about what they'd seen or felt on the job. There was no hierarchy, no lectures. It was more like old friends sharing stories, even though some were much younger than him. At first, the idea surprised people. Officers weren't used to sitting around and discussing feelings or lessons. But slowly, the room filled each time. People started opening up about difficult arrests, moments of doubt, times they wished they'd handled something differently. The deputy chief listened more than he spoke. Sometimes he'd nod. Sometimes he'd smile sadly, and occasionally, he'd share a small story from his own past. Mistakes he'd made when he was younger. Decisions he regretted and what he learned from them. During one of those talks, someone finally brought up the incident directly. "Sir," one officer said carefully, "why didn't you stop us that day? You could have told us who you were right away." The room went quiet. Everyone waited for his answer. He took a deep breath, looked down for a second, then said, "Because if I had, I would have robbed you of the chance to see who you really are when no one's watching. I wanted to see how we treat people when we think they have no power. That's the real test of our character." His answer left the room completely silent for several moments. Some of the younger officers looked down, reflecting. Others nodded slowly, then he smiled faintly and added, "You all passed. That's something to be proud of." After that conversation, the story spread again, but this time not as gossip. It became an example. Other precincts heard about it and started having similar discussions about ethics and respect. What had started as a misunderstanding turned into something that quietly reshaped the culture of an entire department. Meanwhile, the store manager who had made the original call couldn't stop thinking about what had happened either. He had gone through the security footage over and over, realizing how quickly he'd assumed the worst. A week later, he came to the station personally to apologize. He brought a small bag with the receipt and a letter inside. When the deputy chief saw him in the lobby, he recognized him immediately. The manager's face was red with embarrassment. I just wanted to say how sorry I am," he stammered. "I should have checked before calling. I feel terrible about it." The deputy chief shook his head kindly. "You don't need to feel terrible. You made a call based on what you believed at the time. Mistakes happen. What matters is you came here today. That says a lot about your character." The man looked relieved. "I've been thinking a lot about it," he said. "It made me realize how easily people can be judged. I've started telling my staff to always double-check before assuming anything." The deputy chief smiled softly. Then something good already came out of it. After the manager left, the officers who witnessed the interaction talked quietly among themselves. They noticed how genuine the exchange was. No anger, no arrogance, just understanding. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about growth. In the following weeks, more changes began to appear. The department revised its approach to community complaints. They started sending small follow-up messages to people who had called in cases, thanking them for cooperating and explaining the outcome when possible. It seemed like a small gesture, but it built trust. People began to see the officers differently, not just as enforcers, but as neighbors who cared. One afternoon, the deputy chief sat in his office, looking out the window as the sun started to set over the city. The reflection of the sky painted the walls in shades of gold and orange. He thought about how everything had unfolded, how one simple misunderstanding had become a turning point. He opened his drawer and pulled out the same receipt from that morning at the store. It was still folded neatly. He smiled to himself. "Sometimes," he murmured quietly, "the hardest lessons come wrapped in small moments." A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was the young rookie from the fingerprint desk. She looked a little nervous but determined. "Sir, I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you said after the meeting. It meant a lot." He tilted his head slightly. What part? When you said to trust the process, she replied. I wasn't sure about this job at first. I used to worry about making mistakes. But after what happened, I realized doing the right thing isn't about being perfect. It's about staying honest even when you don't know who's sitting in front of you. The deputy chief smiled warmly. That's exactly right. And never forget, this badge doesn't make us better than anyone else. It reminds us that we serve them. She nodded, smiling shyly before stepping out. Later that night, as the building grew quieter, he walked through the halls once more. The echo of footsteps on the tiled floor reminded him of the day he'd been escorted down the same path in handcuffs. Back then it had felt strange and humbling. Now it felt meaningful, like life had brought him full circle. He stopped at the entrance for a moment, watching the night shift officers prepare for duty. They greeted him respectfully, and he returned the gesture with a calm nod. Be safe out there, he said softly. As he stepped into the cool night air, he took a deep breath. The city lights stretched before him, streets filled with people living ordinary lives, each with their own struggles and stories. That thought grounded him. Being in charge didn't mean being above anyone. It meant understanding them better. By the end of that week, the department wasn't the same. Something subtle had changed. People were kinder to each other. They listened more, rushed less, and treated every situation with a little more patience. The arrest that had once been seen as an embarrassment had quietly turned into a symbol, a reminder that even mistakes can become lessons when handled with grace. And as for the deputy chief, he never spoke publicly about that day again. He didn't want it to become a story about him. To him, it was about everyone else. The young officer who stayed calm, the rookie who trusted the system, the captain who listened before judging, and even the store manager who found the courage to say sorry. Those were the people who made the story worth remembering. And in his heart, he knew something simple but powerful. Sometimes, leadership isn't about giving orders or making speeches. It's about living through something real, letting it humble you, and using that moment to lift everyone else higher. That was what the arrest had done. It had stunned the department, yes, but not because it exposed weakness. It stunned them because it reminded them of what strength truly looks like. Weeks passed, but the effect of that strange morning continued to echo through the department. It wasn't something anyone could easily forget. The incident had become more than a story. It had quietly turned into a mirror that made everyone look at themselves a little differently. The deputy chief never once brought it up again in an official way. He didn't need to. The lesson had already settled into the minds of those who were there that day. People talked to one another with more care now. They double-checked details, listened longer during interviews, and treated every person they dealt with as if they could be someone important. Because, in truth, everyone was important. Still, for some, the event felt unfinished. There were questions no one had asked, feelings that had never been spoken. The two officers who had made the arrest still carried a strange mix of pride and guilt. They knew they'd followed procedure exactly as they should. But something about arresting their own superior had left a mark they couldn't shake off easily. One afternoon, after finishing paperwork, they decided to visit the deputy chief's office. They stood outside for a moment, hesitating before knocking. He looked up from his desk as they entered and gestured for them to sit. "Everything all right?" he asked. The younger officer spoke first. "Sir, we just wanted to say, we're sorry about that day. We didn't know." The deputy chief leaned back slightly, a small smile appearing on his face. "You don't need to apologize. You did your jobs." "I know," the officer said quietly, "but still it feels strange. We handcuffed you. We brought you in. It doesn't sit right." He nodded slowly, understanding what they meant. "Let me tell you something," he said after a pause. "The day you stop following procedure because of who someone is, that's the day you stop being fair. The moment you hesitate because of a title or a name, justice becomes personal. And justice can't ever be personal." His tone wasn't stern but calm, like a father reminding his children of something important. "You treated me exactly how you would have treated anyone else. That's what I wanted to see. That's what I'm proud of." The officers exchanged a look. They had come expecting correction, but left with gratitude. As they stood to leave, one of them said, "You really mean it, don't you?" "I do," the deputy chief replied. "And I hope you never forget that moment." Not because of who I was, but because of what it showed you about yourself. When they left his office, something in them felt lighter. The air around them seemed easier to breathe. It was the kind of conversation that stays in a person's mind long after it's over. Around the same time, the department was preparing for its yearly community event, an open house where families, schools, and residents could visit the station, meet officers, and learn about safety programs. Usually it was a routine event with booths, food stands, and demonstrations. But that year, the deputy chief had something different in mind. He called the event organizers into a short meeting. This year, he said, I want it to be more about connection than formality. No speeches, no long lines of people shaking hands. Let's create spaces for real conversations. The idea surprised everyone, but they agreed. The day of the event arrived on a bright Saturday morning. The courtyard in front of the station was filled with laughter, the smell of food, and the sound of children running around. Officers stood by smiling, answering questions, showing their equipment to curious kids. The deputy chief walked through the crowd quietly, shaking hands, talking with parents, and listening to their stories. Some people mentioned how the police had helped them before. Others spoke about moments when they felt misunderstood. He didn't interrupt or defend, he just listened, nodding, taking mental notes. At one point, he found himself speaking to an elderly man who had once worked as a teacher. The man smiled and said, You know, the hardest part about leading people is remembering that they're all learning too. The deputy chief nodded thoughtfully. That's true, he said. And sometimes the teacher learns the biggest lesson by accident. The man chuckled softly. Sounds like experience talking. You could say that, the deputy chief replied, smiling. Later that afternoon, a group of officers joined him near the stage that had been set up for short announcements. The captain encouraged him to say a few words to close the event. He hesitated at first. He never liked attention, but finally agreed. When he stepped up, the crowd quieted. The sun was starting to dip behind the buildings, casting a warm golden light. He didn't hold a script. He didn't read from notes. He just spoke from the heart. I want to thank all of you for being here today, he began. I've been part of this department for many years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that trust doesn't come from uniforms or badges. It comes from listening, really listening. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. Not long ago, something happened in this department that reminded us all of that truth. A mistake, an honest one, turned into one of the most valuable lessons of my career. It showed me that respect isn't about rank or title. It's about how we treat people when no one's looking. The crowd was silent. Even those who didn't know the full story could feel the sincerity in his voice. We're not perfect, he continued. No department, no person ever is. But what matters is that we keep learning, keep improving, and never forget that our job isn't just to enforce rules. It's to serve people. When he stepped down, the applause that followed wasn't loud or wild. It was soft, steady, and genuine. The kind of sound that carried emotion rather than excitement. After the event ended, he stayed behind, helping volunteers pack up. Some of the younger officers came over to thank him for what he said. One of them admitted, That story you mentioned, it changed the way I see this job. I think everyone needed to hear it. He smiled and replied, I'm glad. Just remember, every mistake has a purpose if we let it teach us. That night, as he drove home, the city lights shimmered across the windshield. For the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The department was in a better place and more united, more understanding. The arrest that once felt humiliating had somehow turned into a source of pride, but deep down he knew it wasn't over. Lessons like that don't end in a single moment. They unfold slowly, through choices, through the way people treat one another day after day. Over the next few months, he began noticing small but meaningful changes. Reports were written with more care. Officers who once rushed through cases now took extra time to understand them. Even the way they spoke to people on the street seemed different, less sharp, more human. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big headlines or awards, but the change was real. It showed up in quiet moments. A smile shared during a tense situation, an apology offered instead of an argument, a simple act of kindness during a call. One evening, he walked through the locker room and overheard two officers talking. One of them was reminding the other to go easy on that guy. You never know what story he's carrying. The deputy chief smiled to himself. That single sentence told him everything he needed to know. The lesson had taken root. He often thought back to that morning at the electronics store. The sound of the sliding door, the confused look of the clerk, the chill of the handcuffs. Small details that had once felt embarrassing now felt like milestones. Each piece of that day had shaped something larger than he'd ever planned. It wasn't about pride. It was about purpose. He realized something profound, that leadership wasn't about never being wrong. It was about what you did when you were misunderstood, how you carried yourself when the world didn't see your title, only your humanity. That night before heading home, he stopped by the front desk of the station, the same spot where his name had once been entered as a suspect. The same desk where a young officer had looked at him with uncertainty and respect. He rested his hand lightly on the counter and smiled. "You never really know where life will test you," he said softly, almost to himself. "But if you stay honest through it, the test becomes a gift." The clerk behind the desk looked up, confused, not realizing what he meant. The deputy chief just smiled again, nodded, and walked away into the fading light outside. And though the city still had its problems, noise, chaos, and endless calls that filled every day, the department moved forward with a little more heart than before. Because sometimes all it takes is one unexpected moment to remind an entire team what it truly means to serve. Life at the department slowly returned to a steady rhythm, but something had changed beneath the surface. Officers no longer rushed through their day simply to check tasks off a list. There was a quiet sense of awareness, a new understanding that every interaction, no matter how small, carried weight. The arrest that had once stunned everyone was no longer a single event. It had become a lens through which every officer began to see their work and their role in the community. For the deputy chief, the changes were subtle but deeply satisfying. He could see it in the way new recruits listened more carefully during training, in the way seasoned officers paused to explain things instead of simply instructing, and even in the way reports were written with extra care. The human side of policing, the empathy and patience that often gets overshadowed by procedure, had slowly begun to flourish. One morning, he arrived at the station early. The sun was barely rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. A few officers were already outside, checking their vehicles and greeting each other with the kind of casual camaraderie that came from shared experience. He paused for a moment to watch them. The day was ordinary, yet it felt different, steadier, warmer, as though the department itself had grown a little wiser. Inside the building, the deputy chief walked through the hallways, nodding to officers and staff. He stopped briefly at the fingerprint desk, where the rookie officer who had discovered his identity weeks ago was busy processing prints. She looked up and smiled as he approached. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning, sir," she replied a little shyly. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning slightly against the desk, "about that day and how it's changed all of us." She nodded. "It definitely made me think about the job differently. I wasn't sure I could handle situations like that before, but now—" Her voice trailed off and she smiled, letting the words remain unspoken. The deputy chief smiled back. "That's what matters. Learning is what makes us better, not just following rules." He walked away feeling lighter. Moments like these reminded him why he had stayed in the department for so many years. Not for power, not for recognition, but to guide people toward understanding, to help them see beyond the surface. The following week, the department held a review of procedures, partly as a routine check, partly inspired by what had happened during the arrest. Officers gathered in the briefing room, notebooks open, pens ready. But instead of the usual lecture format, the deputy chief had asked for a discussion, a chance for everyone to speak freely. One by one, officers shared experiences from the field, focusing not on failures or successes, but on the choices they made in moments of uncertainty. A senior officer spoke about a call where a misunderstanding could have escalated. A rookie shared how she had learned to slow down and listen before acting, and even the captain admitted that he had sometimes moved too quickly in the past. The deputy chief listened, occasionally asking quiet questions, encouraging reflection rather than criticism. Every comment added to a sense of cohesion in the room, a shared understanding that the real work wasn't about authority. It was about responsibility, empathy, and humility. By the end of the session, the officers left the room talking quietly among themselves. Something had shifted. The lesson of the arrest was no longer about embarrassment, misunderstanding, or surprise. It was about growth. Every officer who had been there that morning now carried it with them, shaping the way they approached every day. One afternoon, the deputy chief found himself back at the electronics store, this time in uniform. The manager recognized him immediately and greeted him warmly. "I wanted to thank you again," the manager said, "for everything, your patience, the way you handled things. It made a big difference for me and my staff." He smiled, shaking the man's hand. "Mistakes happen," he said. "It's how we respond that matters." The clerk who had first reported the missing item nodded. "We've learned a lot too," he said. "We check before calling now, and we try to see things clearly before assuming anything." The deputy chief felt a quiet satisfaction. Small actions, small lessons, but they had a ripple effect. He could see it in their eyes, understanding, reflection, humility. Moments like this reminded him that leadership wasn't just about giving orders or making decisions. It was about planting seeds of thought, letting them grow in ways you might never see. Back at the department, the changes continued quietly. Officers began mentoring each other in small ways, sharing experiences and advice instead of only instructions. Reports were written with more clarity, calls were handled with patience, and a sense of unity grew stronger. The incident had become a silent guide, reminding everyone that every decision mattered, every action counted, and every person deserved respect. The deputy chief also made time to meet individually with officers who had struggled with confidence or uncertainty. He spoke gently, listened carefully, and shared his own experiences. He didn't lecture, he guided, and slowly, he saw changes. People who had been hesitant before began to act with courage and fairness, balancing procedure with empathy. One day, a young officer came to him, visibly nervous. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I didn't know how I'd handle being in a difficult situation like that day, or any day really, but watching how you handled it and how you turned it into a lesson for all of us, it helped me see what this job really means." The deputy chief put a hand lightly on the officer's shoulder. "You're learning," he said simply. "That's all that matters. Every challenge, every mistake is an opportunity to grow. Don't ever forget that." The officer nodded, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt before. It was more than reassurance. It was a connection to the values the deputy chief had quietly reinforced throughout the department. Months passed, and the arrest that had shocked everyone slowly became part of the department's unofficial history. New recruits heard about it during orientation, not as gossip, but as a story of reflection, fairness, and the importance of integrity. It was no longer about embarrassment. It was about learning, about humility, and about doing the right thing even when no one expected it. Even in the community, small changes were visible. Officers were more approachable, more patient, more willing to explain actions instead of just enforcing rules. The public noticed the difference even if they didn't know why. Respect grew quietly. Relationships strengthened, and the department gained a reputation for thoughtfulness, fairness, and professionalism. The deputy chief often reflected on all of this in quiet moments. Sometimes he would sit in his office late at night, looking out at the city lights, thinking about the day he was arrested and how unexpectedly powerful it had become. What had begun as an ordinary mistake had become a lasting lesson, a reminder that leadership and service were about more than titles, badges, or rank. He realized that the true strength of a department wasn't in its statistics, its arrests, or its reports. It was in the character of the people who worked there, in their ability to treat everyone with fairness, humility, and respect. And if that one moment could teach so many people something so important, he knew it would echo far longer than any formal training ever could. Occasionally, he would meet the young officer who had processed his fingerprints on the morning of the arrest. She would always smile when she saw him. "I still think about that day sometimes," she admitted once. "I realized how much it matters to stay calm and follow procedure. But I also learned to see people as people first." He nodded, understanding perfectly. "Exactly. That's what it's all about. No one is above the process, but everyone deserves respect. Never forget that." Over time, the arrest became less about a single incident and more about the culture it inspired. Officers, both new and experienced, carried the lesson forward in every call, every report, every conversation. The deputy chief's quiet guidance, combined with the experience itself, shaped the way the department approached the world, with empathy, patience, and understanding. Even years later, people still remembered the day. Not because it had been unusual or shocking, but because it had taught something deeper. It reminded everyone that mistakes could become lessons, that humility could inspire change, and that leadership was measured not by power, but by the ability to elevate others. For the deputy chief, it was a moment he never wanted to forget. Not because of embarrassment, not because it made headlines, but because it reminded him why he had chosen this life: to serve, to guide, and to help people see what mattered most. The department, in turn, carried the lesson quietly but powerfully, in the way officers approached every call, every interaction, every decision. The arrest that once stunned them had become a symbol, not of error, but of growth, reflection, and humanity. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all, that true service, true leadership, and true strength come from understanding, humility, and the courage to see every person as more than a case or a statistic, as a human being deserving of patience, fairness, and respect. It was the kind of lesson that would stay with the department forever, quietly shaping the way every officer carried themselves every day, in every choice they made. The arrest that had stunned the department was no longer remembered as a mistake. It was remembered as a turning point, a moment of learning that changed everything for everyone in ways that would last long into the future.